So now that we've fixed the Euler filter on our rotation, we can go back to editing the rest of the curves. So our translate y is our next curve. We've adjusted translate x, and although I may still make some changes to the end, let's go ahead and try our translate y to see if we can make this animation a little stronger overall. So what we're seeing is the same thing we saw on the bouncing ball. Our object traveling up in the air and then back down. Now, if I were to create a motion trail for this, by going to visualization, by going to visualize, create editable motion trail, you'll see that the arcs for my spoon's jump are not very appealing. Like, they're very sine wave shaped instead of bell curve shaped. So let's go in here and break some of these tangents. So if I select these two and I click these two buttons, or this button, to break these tangents, I can start getting a little bit of a better bell curve on that jump. Again, the reason this is important is because as my spoon is coming back down toward the ground, I don't want it to feel like it slows down before it hits the ground. Its gravity is going to continue to pull on it, and it's going to hit the ground at whatever is the appropriate speed. So now this is going to feel a little bit more impactful. There we go. The same with this big jump and the landing inside of the bowl. So let's go here and look at this. I said earlier I wanted to have a lot of hang time. I wanted to feel like the spoon hangs up in the air for a long time on this jump. To do that, we have to make this bell curve kind of big. So I will grab this tangent and break it. And so now I want more flat area at the top of this curve and a sharper angles on the side. And so if I do that, I get a little bit of a sharper impact. The same here. I'm going to add a little bit here, although I have a feeling I'm going to have to make some changes here in just a second to this. So let's see what that motion looks like now. And I'm going to grab that and delete it so we don't have to see it. So that's looking better. It still feels like maybe it's up in the air a little too long and comes down a little slow right there. So that may just be a timing issue. So I'm going to highlight these keyframes and move them back a few. Just make that jump a little shorter. Now, I know by doing that, I likely messed up my translate y bell curve. So I can go in here now and adjust that. Make that a little bit better. The other thing to recognize is the spoon is falling a shorter distance than it traveled going up because it's landing in the bowl and the bowl's a little higher. So there's a chance that the part where the spoon comes down should be a little faster on the timeline as well. So I'm just going to grab these and maybe slide that back one more and see if that makes that a little more appropriate. There we go. So the last few things I want to focus on in the translate y is that little bobble of a bounce when we hit here. So it hits and then just kind of stops. So I need another keyframe out here. So let's go ahead and hit 130. And I'm just going to put a few keyframes in here to mess with on the graph editor just by hitting S. Just to give me some little bobble keyframes to play with. Now we see that to make a bounce, we need a contact, an up, and a contact. So that means I could just go through here and use the existing keys to make some quick contacts and ups. So something like this. Maybe set those to linear temporarily to see how that looks. And let's see, a little bitty tiny bobble. Let's see what that looks like. Too much. So I want to scale those down a little bit so I can zoom in, and I can just go in here and pull the height on these little bitty bounces down even further. And so now it's just hopefully going to feel like a little rattle. There we go. Now I also want to be able to continue maybe sliding the spoon forward just a little bit. So where I'm going to select this and hit F, and so the spoon slides forward there and then kind of falls back. And what I'm going to do is just these keyframes I'll delete, and this one I'll just kind of continue to slide it forward and see if that. So that looks pretty good. Now the last thing I'm going to do is, if I look at my rotation, my rotate X should allow me to rotate my spoon up and down a little bit. So in the same way that I have my spoon bouncing up and down here, I'm going to have it rotating up and down just a little bit as well. So throughout most of this, I've been kind of keeping these on the same frame number, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the truth. What I could do is see where my spoon is up in the air and rotate it up and make those happen in slightly different locations. So for example, drag the spoon down and just start making that rotation happen a little bit more naturally. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and hide the NURBS curve so you can see the motion just a little more clearly in this viewport. Now, that last bobble down feels a little hard to me on Rotate X, so that makes me think that that one's maybe just a little too high. We can do something like that. There we go. Translate Z is really just my side-to-side motion, and there's not a whole lot of that happening. And some of the other rotations are important as well, so it's definitely worth looking at this. So for example, this rotation is the spoon twisting around. And you'll notice that the spoon twists most of that way to here and then seems to sort of flatten out during the last little part here. So we could adjust that, and if we don't want it to rotate all the way around at first, maybe we could sort of play with how this curve happens to see if it feels smoother. The other thing we need to recognize though is we animated the squash and stretch as well. So these keyframes can be edited in the graph editor as well. When we do that, we need to recognize what we're affecting. As this curve goes from a high point to a low point, our spoon is going from stretched to squashed. So, do we want that to happen quickly or not quickly? I don't know. Let's try that and see what we get in either way. If I have this squash happen quickly, if I set this to linear, then it gets to the squash pose a little earlier and holds it. I think these stretch poses, we could maybe set those to linear and see what we get there. There we go. Now the other thing we could do is we could consider adding additional keyframes in here. Again, I could hit the S key, but I could also add a keyframe inside of the graph editor. If I go to keys and either insert key tool or add key tool, I can add additional keys to this curve. I'm going to use the add key tool. I like it more. Now the way the add key tool works is I have to first select a part of this curve, either a keyframe or the entire curve, and then I have to middle click and hold down the middle click. So if I middle click and hold it down, you'll see now I've added a new key and I can move that around. So if I wanted to overshoot the squash here, I could make the squash continue down even as the rest of the character is going back to the neutral pose. This is a really nice way of adding overlapping action to our scene. So I can continue having my spoon stretch and then go to a more squashed pose up here. Now these really subtle changes are going to be barely noticeable as you watch them, but they're going to add up over time, and eventually your animation is just going to look better and better and better. And so what we're seeing now is the result of slow changes over time in the graph editor.